where did I put it? Game object here. Let me just call this, give this a different name, and call this bubbles. Alright, now we can animate the color of the bubbles over time, or fire, or whatever you're making, using the color animator. Now if you don't want to animate color, you can save on RAM by unchecking this box. So now it doesn't animate any color. Okay, if you do want it, and in this case it also does transparency, you can turn it on. So if you click one of the first colors, the bottom slider here is the transparency. Okay, so if you make them less transparent, you can also make them more transparent over time, which is great for smoke, because smoke you want to have fade out over time. Okay, now for example, if I wanted this to be fire, of course I would start it in red, and as you can see there's some particles right here that have a reddish color. If I make it a little more transparent, it's easier to see, like that. Okay, so every time a bubble is created, it starts off red and then fades into white, because all the other fours are white. Let me change the color back to white here, because I don't need my bubbles to be animated in color. Let me uncheck this. Okay, now in our ellipsoid particle emitter, there's some important variables that we need to take into account. There's the size of particles, there's the energy, and then there's the emission. Now the energy is basically the speed of which they're created. So if I change that to, for example, from 3 to 6, you can see that they live a little longer. Okay, so that's the energy. You see the bubbles, they look like there's more, but there's just as many being emitted, but they live longer. If I make them live shorter, for example 1, you can see that there's just as many popping up, but they live a lot shorter. Okay, so let me change this back to, for example, 2. Alright, then you have your emission, and that is how many are emitted at some point. So if, for example, I change it from 550 to 500, all of a sudden there is a whole lot more being emitted over time. Alright, of course I need to change the maximum as well. As you can see, now we have one big cloud of bubbles. Kind of looks pretty cool for a spell effect or something, but 500 is a lot. In that case, you'd rather make your bubble a little bigger. Okay, so let me change this back to, for example, 25. That is a little not enough, so let's change that back to 50. Alright, and then we have the size. You can change the size of when they are created. So I can change it, for example, to minimum of 0.1 and a maximum of 1. And you will notice that they are now randomly in size. It's a little big, so let me change it to 0.5, for example. Wait until the other ones died. As you can see, now we have different sizes of bubbles. Okay, now let's be subtle here. Let me change it to 0.2. We don't want every one of them to be the same size, but we want to have a little bit of a reality in here. Okay, now the ellipsoid, the size of this ball that we use to spark, is changed in the ellipsoid here. So now, right now it's set to 1, 1, and 1 in X, Y, and Z. But for example, if you want it to be taller up, you can change the Y to 2, and now it becomes a shape like this. Okay, so I hope this still makes sense, and I'm not dazzling your mind with all the options, but you know, it's pretty understandable when you did it a couple times, so I recommend following along. Now there's also an option here, simulate in world space. Now this is very important, so make sure you pay attention on this part. When it's simulated in world space, the particle that is created actually stays at the point where it is created in the world. So if I move this around, you can see the particles stay at the spot in the world where they were created. Okay, so this is very handy if you want to create a trail. For example, when you saw when I played the game, the barrels coming down, the particles are created in the world, and then they stay there. However, if you do not want them to stay in world space, but follow the mesh around, look at what happens. I can move them all at once. So that is the difference. And you know, in different cases, you want to have different things. But in this case, I want to simulate in world space. Now there's another one that's important, that's one shot. And one shot means they're only created once and then they die out. Okay, so that is, for example, an explosion. You only want to be one explosion, boom, and after that you want it to die out. So that is what one shot does. Okay, so that is pretty much most of the things that we need here for the ellipsoid particle emitters. The other ones we don't really need to cover right now. Okay, then we have the animator, and if you want to move the bubbles up in space, I highly recommend using the particle animator and not going into the velocity of your ellipsoid particle emitter. Whenever you want to move particles, it's just safest to go with the particle animator instead. Now in this case we want the bubbles to go up just like in an aquarium, so if I change my Y to 2, you can see now they have a force up and they do exactly what I want. Now they are simulated in world space, so now you can see that when I move this slowly, it has a really cool effect of actual bubbles sparking off a certain item. Okay, now it's a little fast. Let's change it to 1, see what happens. It's a little slower animation. So yeah, that's about right. Well, 1.4. I'm always a little bit picky about everything, not that it matters much. Okay, now we have that. We pretty much can go to the next part of the particle renderer here. Of course, there's a lot more things you can do with the particle animator. I just recommend reading the documents and tweaking and finding out yourself. Let's go to the particle renderer, and the renderer of course renders the item here. Now you can add multiple materials by setting the size to 2, and then it adds one. For example, I can add a different bubble. I think I have 2. There you go. So now I have bubbles with, like, there are double ones and there are single ones. So you can add as many materials as you want since this is an array. Okay, now you can stretch your particles. Billboard means that they're actually facing the camera, but you can also stretch them, and then you can change the stretching is basically on the length here. So if I want, for example, a flame to shoot out of a turret that I did, for example, in the first-person shooter tutorial on tornadotwins.com/fps, then I'm using this stretching. So, but billboard is mostly what you want in this case. Okay. Then you can change the size, of course, of your particles, and you can also animate the UVs. So if you wanted to, if you want the picture in itself to, if it's a tileable picture, for example, and you want it to change over time, you can animate the UVs using this. So that's pretty much particles that I've explained in here. So in the next video, we'll go over and make the actual explosion for our Worminator game and explode the turret after that. So that should be pretty exciting and give us quite a bunch of gameplay, and I'm looking forward to showing you that next.